After the affair, Augustine's mistress sent me a video. A weary man, freshly returned from the hospital, took the baby from the doctor's hands, his face filled with the joy of becoming a father. I expressionlessly pressed the phone screen off, thinking of my daughter who had already turned one overseas. I sent a message to her father. Bring her back. Chapter 1. Augustine's mistress was about to give birth. He received the call while we were out celebrating our 5th wedding anniversary. Augustine, I'm about to give birth. The woman on the other end of the line let out a suppressed cry of pain. Augustine instinctively stood up, his tone tensed but still maintaining his usual composure. How did it happen so soon? Wait for me. I'll be there right away. I put down my knife and fork and looked at him, confused. Who called? A brief flash of panic crossed Augustine's face, but it quickly disappeared. Emmy, sorry. Something urgent came up at the company. I'll have my assistant take you home shortly. With those 2 simple sentences, Augustine left without looking back. Watching his departing figure, I opened my phone. What greeted me was a message from Augustine's mistress. Miss Liu, I'm the woman your husband has been keeping on the side. I'm about to give birth now. Do you think Augustine will stay with you or come to the hospital to be with me? The provocative words were enough to show she thought she had already won. I turned off my phone, not bothered by the message, because I already knew Augustine had been cheating during our marriage and had been keeping a mistress on the side. As for the child, just an illegitimate one. Chapter 2. My marriage to Augustine was a business arrangement. The union, formed for the sake of family interests, meant we had no emotional connection to each other. On top of that, the 7-year age gap made me particularly resistant to him. After marriage, we kept our distance, waiting for the 3-year agreement period to end, at which point we would put a final stop to this union. But no one had expected that. After a year of polite distance, Augustine and I would actually develop feelings for each other, like a worn-out plot from a cheesy romance novel. Augustine and I fell in love after marriage. He was humble, gentle, and courteous, despite being only a contract husband. He took meticulous care of me. He was mature, composed, and thoughtful, slowly teaching me the ways of the world. He was witty, graceful, and calm, always showing up when I needed help the most. And so, little by little, I found myself falling into the trap of his tenderness until the day of the first snow in City A. He took me to the tallest skyscraper in City A and arranged for a 3-hour fireworks display just for me, under the dazzling fireworks. Augustine knelt before me, the bright lights outlining his silhouette, reflecting the image of me, small in his eyes. He said, Emily, from today onwards, let's be a real couple, shall we? Chapter 3. The past with Augustine had already blurred with time, but this particular moment remained deeply etched in my mind. But no matter how beautiful the memories or how solemn the vows, they meant nothing in front of a man who had betrayed me. I knew Augustine probably wouldn't come home tonight. So, after leaving the restaurant, I didn't return home. Instead, I went alone to the villa in City A. The villa was regularly cleaned, and when Augustine wasn't home, I often stayed there. He didn't know I had this place in City A. I had thought Augustine's mistress might behave more quietly tonight, but in the middle of the night, she suddenly sent me a video. In the video, a weary man carefully took the baby from the doctor's hands, his face full of the joy of becoming a father. It was the first time I had ever seen Augustine look like this. Did he really like children? I wasn't sure. Back when we were still in love, I had eagerly asked him if he wanted a child. At the time, he didn't answer. It was only me who kept chattering on and on. In the end, I never got an answer. Now that answer, delayed by several years, was right in front of me. Augustine did like children, but the child was his mistress's. Chapter 4. Augustine had always had someone he loved but could never have. I found this out only after he had cheated on me. How laughable. I had once thought that he loved me. How else could he have walked with me in the snow, around and around in circles downstairs, even though our shoes and socks were soaked, just to help me build a snowman? How else could he have bought out all the city's large screens on my birthday so that the fireworks would only bloom for me? How else could he have begged and prayed, wishing only for my health when I was sick with a high fever? His actions made me feel like a spoiled child, allowed to indulge in his love without a care. But later, someone told me everything he did for me, he had done for someone else. What I once thought was special treatment and preference was merely Augustine reliving a love that had once defined him. I had been a fool, believing I was deeply entrenched in happiness, unaware that this happiness was nothing but a joke. I expressionlessly pressed the phone screen off, my heart already calm, without a single ripple. From the moment I learned of Augustine's affair, the Emily who had loved him was already dead. Chapter 5. Discovering Augustine's affair was purely accidental. Before we got married, he used to spend one day a month volunteering at a stray cat shelter. I once asked him if he volunteered because he liked cats. At the time, he didn't deny it. But after learning about my allergy to cat fur, he never went back until the 3rd year of our marriage, when I ended up in the hospital with an anaphylactic shock. The tests revealed it was caused by cat fur. But the housekeepers knew about my allergies and would never have brought cat fur into the house. And the only person close enough to me was Augustine. Yet he knew perfectly well about my allergy. Perhaps it was a woman's intuition. But I hired someone to investigate Augustine when the private investigator laid the photos in front of me. I could hardly believe the man in them, smiling softly. His eyes full of love was Augustine. He looked so happy. Radiating the joy of having found something he'd lost, he gently nuzzled the woman's cheek and nose, as if trying to hold her tightly in his embrace forever. They kissed passionately, fingers intertwined, the affection between them practically spilling out of the frame. I had never felt such intense emotion from Augustine, even when he kissed me. It was always soft and restrained. What was even more absurd was that he had rekindled his relationship with Oriana as soon as she returned to the country. And they were even raising a stray cat together. At that moment, I felt sick to my core, sick like never before. Chapter 6. I dug deep into Augustine and Oriana's past. Even though he had tried to hide it, I still unearthed quite a bit. The prodigal son in love with the poor girl, only to be torn apart by his family's disapproval. What a cliché. And it only made me feel more like a clown. I torture myself by repeatedly going through their history. No wonder he never spoke about his past relationships. No wonder he always seemed so composed and in control. His sincerity, his passion, his recklessness. They had already been completely given to someone else. What was left for me was nothing but a hollow pretense. But why did he have to involve me? Why deceive me and make me endure betrayal after betrayal? I stayed in the room for a full day and night until Augustine came back, acting as if nothing had happened. He even looked at my haggard face with concern and reached out to touch my forehead. Emily, what's wrong? The once gentle and courteous face now appeared distorted and grotesque in my eyes. I couldn't understand how he could act so shamelessly, as if nothing had happened. The anger inside me screamed to tear away the facade. I wanted to rip apart his mask and show him just how despicable and filthy he was, but I knew I couldn't. Why should someone who gave their heart be left in pain? Why should I suffer alone? Why shouldn't those who betray others face consequences? From beginning to end, the one at fault was Augustine. Chapter 7. I reopened my phone, the screen lighting up with a picture of a little mixed-race girl wearing a tiny birthday hat. My heart softened after some thought. I sent a message to someone saved as Q. A call from overseas came almost immediately. The moment it connected, a soft and sweet voice came through. "Hello, Ma." "Ma." Then a tall man appeared on screen, holding a soft little bundle in his arms. My heart instantly melted. Jessica had grown chubbier since I last saw her. Her fair, tender cheeks and curly hair made her look like a sweet rice dumpling. Ignoring the man beside her, I focused entirely on making Jessica laugh. It wasn't until the man knocked on the screen with his knuckle and shifted the camera to himself that I reluctantly tore my gaze away. "What do you mean by saying you want Jessica to come back?" Perhaps because of the air conditioning, Martin was only wearing a loosely tied bathrobe, revealing his broad chest. I kept my gaze steady. I miss her, and Augustine's mistress has given birth. It's about time to settle some scores. Martin's expression was unreadable after a brief frown, his sharp, defined features softened unexpectedly. "So, does that mean you want me to come back too, Bibi?" Chapter 8. Martin is of mixed descent and spent some years in Hong Kong, so he likes to sprinkle in a bit of Cantonese when he calls me Bibi. The way it falls from his lips is both sensual and affectionate. And when I look into his gemstone-like green eyes, I can't help but lose myself in them. I averted my gaze, my eyes flicking over his partially open robe before I snapped. "Get serious. I'm talking business." Martin chuckled softly, but didn't respond. Instead, he turned the camera to focus on Jessica's sleeping face. "Jessica really misses you." "I do too." He whispered the last part. I paused for a moment, but didn't pay much attention. After hanging up, I swiftly switched to another account and opened Augustine's WeChat half an hour ago. He had just updated a post. Blessed with a son. 6. 8 pounds. Well done. The picture showed the newborn baby holding his finger along with a photo of their hands entwined. A group of Augustine and Oriana's mutual friends had commented below congratulating them. I couldn't believe anyone was still unaware that Augustine was married. What was even more ridiculous was how they congratulated him and Augustine himself. He was beyond redemption. Not only had he fathered an illegitimate child with Oriana, but he had also gone to great lengths to hide his affair from me, no matter how much he tried to appear perfect on the surface. He couldn't erase the inherent flaws of men. All my sincerity had been wasted on a dog. I suppressed the disgust rising in my chest and, mimicking others, left a comment below. Once I posted it, I immediately shut off my phone, not wanting to look at it a second longer. Chapter 9. Augustine returned on the 5th day. I had received word from his assistant in advance, so I made sure to return early. He looked exhausted, but there was an unmistakable joy radiating from him. It was hard to believe he could come back so early. Given how much he doted on his son, I teasingly asked him, "What's the good news?" Augustine only smiled without responding. I lowered my head, fiddling with the plants, curious how he would handle the mother and child outside. Divorce was out of the question. Now, the interests of our families were inseparably linked. If it had been a few years ago, it would have been much simpler. Augustine must have known this too. Otherwise, he wouldn't have allowed Oriana to secretly give birth to his illegitimate child. It was laughable. Before marrying Augustine, I was just a pawn in a family alliance. It was Augustine who slowly taught me the ways of the world, helping me secure a place in Lou Group. Did Augustine love me back then? No. He just wanted a wife who was a good match for him, and I foolishly gave him my heart. But sincerity is the easiest thing to be betrayed. Men like Augustine always feel that they can't get the best, even when it's right in front of them. As for Oriana, she wasn't innocent either. If she were, how could she dare to secretly send messages to provoke me? She wanted me to see the evidence of Augustine's affair, hoping I'd be devastated and back off. But it wasn't that easy. I had invested my time, my energy, and my heart. It wasn't something Augustine's trivial gestures could make up for. Chapter 10. After I calmed down, Augustine resumed his usual humble and gentle demeanor. He opened his mouth, clearly hesitating before speaking. Emily. I looked up at him, curious about what he was going to say next. I have a friend. His wife just had a baby before he could finish. I immediately interrupted him, half serious and half joking. Stop. I've seen this kind of thing online where people say I have a friend, but it's really just about themselves. I paused, stretching the last word out. Augustine, you're not talking about yourself. Are you? There was no panic on Augustine's face. He smiled and walked over, gently pulling me into his embrace, his voice impossibly soft. How could it be? It's just that my friend's wife just had a baby. And on their way home, they had a car accident before he passed. He entrusted the child to me and asked me to adopt him. If you're not willing, I'll respect your decision. I sneered inwardly. How clever of Augustine to come up with such an absurd excuse, spinning a convoluted backstory for his illegitimate child. He couldn't divorce me, but his illegitimate child needed a legitimate identity. So he was trying to pin the responsibility on me. He wanted me to adopt the child and treat him as my own. Even when I found out the truth, it would already be set in stone. His illegitimate child would become the rightful heir. Augustine was absolutely confident. He was sure I loved him deeply. So no matter the reason, I wouldn't divorce him. After all, Emily, the pragmatic, diplomatic woman, was the result of his careful grooming. How could someone like me, who loved him to the bone, ever leave him? Chapter 11. I didn't answer his words, but instead reached out and pulled him back into an embrace. Speaking seriously, Augustine, are you thinking about having a child? After saying this, I deliberately pointed to the wrinkles at the corner of his eye. Well, you're getting older. It's my fault for not wanting a child these past 2 years. How about we have a child then? Biological children are always better than adopted ones. After all, as the saying goes, you can't raise a wolf in your own home. What if the child we adopt turns out to be a wolf in sheep's clothing? Since finding out about Augustine's affair, I had refused to sleep with him, fearing disease. My excuse was that I didn't want to have a child, and since we were often apart because of company business. And he was being tied down by Oriana. We didn't have much of a married life to begin with. Augustine's expression visibly stiffened. He held me and, with rare patience, spoke on behalf of his illegitimate child, Emily. I know you don't want to have a child. I don't want you to go through the pain of childbirth either. Just adopt that child. All problems will be solved. And I promise you, he won't turn out to be that kind of wolf in sheep's clothing. I didn't respond, just gently pushed him away and teased him in a joking tone. Augustine, you're so concerned about that child. He won't be your illegitimate child, will he? Augustine's expression remained unchanged, his face calm, his demeanor light and self-assured. Emily, don't you trust me? In the past, if Augustine had said this, I would have never doubted him. But now, Augustine, how can I trust you? I couldn't help but laugh, breaking the tense silence. All right, I was just teasing you. I've always believed in you. After I let up, Augustine wasted no time in leaving the villa. His assistant messaged me. MS. Lou, mister. Ning is going to pick up the child now. After discovering Augustine's affair, I spent a large sum of money to bribe his personal assistant. That's how I was able to add Augustine's second account and find out about his movements with Ariana. It seemed Augustine cared more about that child than I had imagined. And Oriana, would she be willing to let me adopt her child? Chapter 12. As it turned out, she was not. When Augustine brought the child back, his assistant also sent me a message. MS. Lou, mister. Ning also brought the young lady back. She's currently being settled in his private residence, but it seems they had a huge argument on the way. I wasn't surprised by the assistant's words. No one would willingly give up their child for adoption, especially not Oriana. I had done my research on her. She was an ambitious woman who had not dated anyone since breaking up with Augustine. Perhaps she was convinced Augustine loved only her, and she left for abroad without looking back. But what she didn't expect was that Augustine would marry me, especially after seeing how frequently we showed off our love online. She couldn't keep calm, so without hesitation, she returned to the country, even if it meant taking on the label of a mistress to rekindle her affair with Augustine. I curved my lips into a smile and sent a message to my assistant before suddenly starting to look forward to the scene of Augustine bringing the child back. Chapter 13. When Martin came to the villa from the airport, Augustine hadn't returned yet. He stood at the door wearing a baby carrier on his shoulder and holding a large suitcase in his hand. I took Jessica from him, feeling her heavy weight, and affectionately nuzzled her little face. Did you miss me, Jessica? Perhaps it had been too long since we last met. Jessica puckered her lips, her eyes the same shade of green as her father's, tearing up with a little whimper. I quickly comforted her. Oh, it's my fault. I made you sad. Jessica. Martin bent down, gently soothing Jessica, completely unaware of the awkwardness of being in someone else's home. Be good, baby. At that moment, Augustine walked in with the child, and I was playing with Jessica. He seemed stunned to see another child in the house, standing frozen in place, without noticing that the baby in his arms had started crying. On the other hand, Jessica, startled, stumbled and threw herself into my arms, crying, wah, scared. Her crying quickly caught the attention of Martin, who had been in the kitchen preparing Jessica's milk. He rushed over hurriedly, still holding the milk bottle in his hand. His deep gaze landed on Augustine and the baby in his arms. Before he nonchalantly looked away, he tightened the bottle, crouched down, and gently used the bottle to distract Jessica. Jessica, be good. Look at this. Come to Daddy. Augustine's gaze immediately darkened. He walked over to me, his eyes shifting back and forth between Martin and me, the tension palpable. After a long while, he squeezed out a sentence. Emily, who are they? I glared at him reproachfully. Didn't you say you wanted to adopt a child? But I don't know how to take care of a child. Luckily, I know someone who does. So I asked him to come over. And Augustine, don't you think? I pointed to Jessica, who was being cradled by Martin and fed milk, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. Doesn't she resemble me? Especially around the eyes and lips? Chapter 14. Augustine looked at Martin and Jessica suspiciously. Emily, when did you get friends? I don't know. I shrugged. He's a partner of my company. This is his daughter, Jessica. I wish I had a daughter like her. There was an unmistakable disappointment in my voice. Augustine immediately became on edge. He scrutinized Jessica for a moment before shaking his head. Emily, I don't think she looks much like you. Indeed, Jessica didn't resemble me much. She looked more like Martin. After saying this, he turned to Martin, extended his hand, and introduced himself. "Hello, I'm Emily's husband, Augustine." Martin didn't respond, but simply nodded, his expression cold. Augustine, slightly awkward, still tried to make conversation. "Your daughter is very beautiful, but where's her mother?" Upon hearing this, Martin finally reacted, holding Jessica. He gave me a quick glance. I smiled, and, as our gazes met, he lowered his head and softly coaxed, "Jessica, tell Uncle, where's your mommy?" As soon as she heard the word mom, Jessica immediately looked at me, stretched out her arms toward me, and kept murmuring, "Mama, Mama." I smiled in mock surprise and responded, "Oh, Jessica, do you miss me?" Augustine seemed to be triggered and reflexively said, "Children can't just call anyone Mama." He immediately stepped in front of me, shielding me from view, urgently trying to show me the child in his arms. I glanced at the child and then reached out to gently poke him. Augustine was delighted. "Look at him. He's so cute." He continued to praise the child. His joy and pride as a father clearly displayed without reservation. I withdrew my hand, disinterested, and humored him. "Well, if that's the case, then let's adopt him. How about we throw a party tomorrow?" It seemed Augustine didn't expect me to agree so easily. He paused for a moment before breaking into a smile. Okay, we'll do as Emily says." Chapter 15. Augustine threw a grand party, and almost all the influential figures from City A were present. He walked through the crowd holding the child, greeting everyone with words full of energy and enthusiasm. A few ladies seemed to catch on to something and, not wanting me to remain in the dark, kindly warned me. "Lou, it seems your husband, Mr. Ning, is particularly concerned about this child." I took a sip of my drink and smiled lightly. "This is Augustine's friend's child, and also the future heir of Ning Group. We're adopting him, so of course we're paying attention." The ladies shook their heads, their faces filled with pity. I sneered inwardly. Pity me for what? Pity that my husband cheated while I, his legitimate wife, was kept in the dark and naively planned to adopt his illegitimate child. Come to think of it, I should thank Augustine. It was he who led the naive and ignorant me into the deceitful world of business and taught me how to gradually grasp power in my own hands. He polished me into the sharpest weapon. I still remember the day when Lu Group was fully under my control, and that feeling of holding power was far more intoxicating than love. When a person has enough status, position, and power, all those subordinate titles lose their meaning. So, these ladies didn't call me Mrs. Ning but MS. Lu. All of this was thanks to him. Now I'm preparing a grand gift to repay him. Chapter 16. While Augustine was on stage holding the child and giving a speech, Martin walked over to me with Jessica in his arms. I took her into my arms and started playing with her. A few ladies, upon seeing Jessica, exchanged uncertain glances. Lu. This. I raised the corner of my mouth and deliberately said, "Does she look a bit like me?" I said what they didn't dare to voice, then continued to playfully tease Jessica. "I'd love to have such a cute daughter. Too bad. I'm afraid that wish will remain unfulfilled." No sooner had I spoken than a sharp voice suddenly pierced through the air from behind. "Augustine, who do you want our child to recognize as his mother?" It was Oriana. She was dressed in opulent clothing, but her pale face couldn't hide the exhaustion, even under layers of makeup. The crowd parted for her as she made her way toward me. Despite her disheveled appearance, she still stood tall. She glared at Augustine with fury. Her face, though excessively beautiful, looked somewhat frightening in that moment. I nearly died giving birth to our child. "You promise me you divorce her and give me a rightful place." "You lied to me," she screamed hysterically. But on stage, Augustine remained unnervingly calm. He called over the bodyguards, ordering them coldly to remove Oriana without mercy. Where did this madwoman come from? Get her out of here now. In that moment, I realized Augustine might not love Oriana as much as I thought. The so-called love he had was always conditional, based on maintaining his image as a good husband and securing his personal interests. Once someone tried to destroy the facade he had so carefully built, even if that person had once been a crush he couldn't have, he would discard them without a second thought. Chapter 17. As the two of them confronted each other, murmurs began to spread throughout the crowd. Martin took Jessica from my arms. With the gesture of blocking, he quietly scratched my palm with his pinky finger. I raised the corner of my mouth but acted as if nothing had happened, calmly retracting my hand. On stage, Augustine's expression grew colder and more impatient. His elevated stance made it easy for him to look down on Oriana with contempt, his eyes filled with warning. Oriana swayed, perhaps unable to believe that the man she loved would treat her this way. She collapsed to the ground in a weakened state. I exhaled softly. The show couldn't end just yet. I sent a message to my bodyguard, and the large screen at the banquet flickered with one piece of evidence after another of Augustine's infidelity. The paparazzi, who had been whispering among themselves, rushed forward with their cameras as if they had just been injected with excitement. Chairman Ning, can you explain the illegitimate child in your arms? Chairman Ning, does a mess. Lu know about your affair? Chairman Ning, please answer my question. Seeing Augustine surrounded by a crowd of paparazzi, I curled my lips into a smile and turned to leave. Chapter 18. When Augustine returned, he was disheveled. I sat quietly on the living room sofa, not arguing, not questioning, not angry, just calmly pushing the divorce agreement toward him. You cheated. Let's get a divorce. Augustine parted his lips, but said nothing. He simply pushed the divorce agreement back toward me. Emily, I won't divorce you. Of course, Augustine wouldn't choose to divorce. A divorce at this time would severely damage the name group. He wouldn't make such a loss-making deal. Just like how our marriage had been a business transaction from the start. I didn't speak, but instead, I took out another agreement. Do you remember this agreement? Augustine stared at me, without speaking. It seemed he had already forgotten about the agreement. Before Oriana came back, Augustine and I still had sweet and loving days. At that time, taking advantage of his affection for me, I threw a tantrum and unrestrainedly had him draft a marital agreement. If either party cheats, the other party shall receive half of their assets. At the time, I treated this agreement as an unwavering vow of marital fidelity, proof of Augustine's love for me. But perhaps to Augustine, it was just a trivial trick to placate me. So he signed it without much care. But what he didn't anticipate was that I took it seriously. I waved the agreement in front of Augustine. Forgotten. Your signature is right there. It's legally binding. If I sue, you'll lose. Chapter 19. I should have brought out this agreement 2 years ago, but I didn't. I knew Augustine was meticulous in his actions. Even if I filed a lawsuit, it might end in nothing due to insufficient evidence. Not only would I not get what I deserved, but I could end up with nothing at all. So I waited until his illegitimate child was born. The evidence of his bloodline connection was something he could never erase. It was irrefutable proof of his affair. I knew Augustine would never give me half of the Ning family's assets, so I slapped the agreement in his face. Kneel and beg me, kneel and beg me. And if I'm satisfied, we can have a peaceful divorce. This agreement can be voided. Augustine's expression changed instantly. How could he kneel and beg me? His pride, his self-esteem, and his integrity would never allow him to beg the woman he had once molded into something so humble. But when faced with half of Ning's family wealth, he couldn't resist the inner urge to submit. Slowly, he bent one knee and his straight back lowered. Emily, I'm sorry. It's my fault. I shouldn't have betrayed our marriage.
Please don't divorce me.
I laughed so hard that tears came to my eyes. Look at that. Augustine kneeled before me. He kneeled for half of Ning's family assets. I leisurely stood up and picked up the scattered agreement from the floor, slapping his cheek again and again, humiliating him. Augustine, was it fun keeping me in the dark when you cheated? He didn't speak, so I slapped him like a madwoman, hitting him relentlessly. You're filthy. You're cheap. You're disgusting. Augustine became even more disheveled. He lowered his head, his voice hoarse. Emily, vent all your anger on me. It's my fault. We won't divorce. Okay? I laughed aloud. Augustine, do you know? You now look like a miserable dog. His face visibly paled. I closed my eyes, put on an expression of heartbreak, and handed him the pen. Sign it. Let's part on good terms. This is the last bit of dignity. I'll leave you. Augustine shakily raised his hand, hesitated, then finally signed his name on the agreement. Chapter 20. Emily, I know I've wronged you, but you have to believe I still love you. Augustine said this while his gaze remained fixed on the agreement in my hands. I took the divorce agreement, and as I flipped open one page, Augustine suddenly snatched the agreement from me with lightning speed. Then, right in front of me, he tore it into pieces. In an instant, he seemed to have regained his confidence, and his gaze darkened as he stared at me. Emily, It's true that I shouldn't have hidden the affair from you, but you shouldn't threaten me with half of Ning's family wealth. I will divorce you, but you will not get a single penny from Ning's family. Now, this was the true Augustine. Cold, ruthless. Even I, the woman who had slept beside him for 3 years, couldn't trust him. I swayed slightly as I stood up from the sofa, my eyes immediately turning crimson.
Ha, ha, ha.
You don't trust me, Augustine. You really don't trust me. Seeing me laugh so wildly, Augustine's face seemed to show a hint of emotion. I closed my eyes. Don't say anything. We'll see each other in court. Augustine's eyes immediately turned grim. Emily, are you sure you want to sue me? I gave a sarcastic laugh. Filled with the despair of a broken mask, wait for the court summons. Augustine, I will make you regret this. Augustine, thinking he would win for sure, sent his lawyer to negotiate the property distribution. I ignored him and decided to proceed with a litigation divorce. The court quickly scheduled the hearing. On the day of the hearing, Augustine himself did not attend. Instead, he hired the best defense lawyer in a city to represent him. He even sent me a message, Emily, you will regret this. Regret? No. The one who will regret this will be him. Augustine never imagined that the agreement he tore up was never the real one, because there was ample evidence of his affair. Combined with the agreement we had signed, the court quickly handed down a verdict. Half of Ning's family assets were granted to me, and since Augustine committed adultery during our marriage, half of his remaining assets were also to be divided. I watched as Augustine's defense lawyer urgently dialed his number, and I began to look forward to seeing Augustine's hysterical, ugly face. That moment should be quite interesting, as expected. Augustine called me shortly after Emily. Are you playing me? His voice was filled with frustration and anger.
He finally realized.
Did he think I was stupid enough to give up half of Ning's assets and hand them back to him? Or did he think that I loved him so deeply that, even after learning of his affair, I wouldn't fight for what I deserved? What was rightfully mine, whether he liked it or not, was mine. Emily, did you already know I cheated? There was a long silence on the other end of the phone before Augustine suddenly spoke. He had finally realized, but it was too late. I chuckled lightly and replied, Augustine, this is all your own doing. Don't forget. Find a good time, and we'll go to the Civil Affairs Bureau to finalize the divorce. As soon as I finished speaking, Martin appeared behind me, holding Jessica. Mom. Jessica blinked innocently, calling out to me almost instantly. It seemed like Augustine understood something, and his tone was filled with uncontainable excitement. Emily, you cheated too. That mixed-race girl. She's the illegitimate daughter you had with Martin, isn't she? Yes, it must be. I quickly covered Jessica's ears and whispered, Shoo. Then I denied it. Augustine, Jessica is not my daughter. Also, the court has already ruled. Find a time, and we'll get the divorce finalized.
But the more I said that,
the more convinced Augustine became that I had an affair with Martin. He sneered, his sharp voice full of unspeakable malice. Emily, you've ruined me. I won't let you off easy. Just wait for it. Chapter 21. Augustine appealed. Meanwhile, rumors about my affair with Martin spread like wildfire. Do you need me to suppress all the news? Martin called while I was in the middle of settling the remaining assets of Ning's family. No need. Just make sure Jessica stays safe and isn't photographed by anyone. I knew very well that this was Augustine's doing. After hanging up, I called my personal assistant. Push Ning's group harder. A crumbling building needs to be replaced by another high-rise. At the second hearing, Augustine looked visibly more haggard. But when he saw me, he still tried to maintain a confident facade, as if victory was assured. Emily, you've lost this time. You and your illegitimate daughter. I'll make sure you both suffer. He lowered his voice, his tone threatening, seeing him so disheveled. I couldn't help but smile, feeling quite pleased. I look forward to your performance today. This time, Augustine came prepared with a lot of evidence. They not only had photos of me with Martin, but had even gone as far as to investigate Jessica's birth date in France, as they presented one piece of evidence after another showing my alleged affair to the judge. The curve of my lips only grew higher. Your Honor, we have evidence proving that a mess. Emily did not commit adultery during the marriage. We have 2 reports. One is a paternity test showing that a mess. Emily and Jessica are not mother and daughter. Another is the adoption paperwork for Mr. Martin, which proves that a mess. Emily and Mr. Martin are only business partners. My defense lawyer presented each piece of evidence. Augustine and his lawyer were left speechless. Stunned, Augustine never expected that Jessica was not my daughter with Martin. This was the real gift I gave him. He had thought that he could turn things around and win, but in reality, he lost everything. Chapter 22. The second court session quickly reached a verdict. Augustine lost the case. On the day we went to the Civil Affairs Bureau for the divorce. It happened to be the day Ning's group was acquired by Lu's group. I wore a bright red dress, mocking him mercilessly. Congratulations, Augustine. You've ruined your name and have nothing left. Augustine was always meticulous in his actions. He was confident I wouldn't discover his affair with Oriana, but he forgot that he was only human and that his secrets would eventually be exposed. From the moment I found out about Oriana, I had been quietly waiting for this day to come. Making Augustine's reputation crumble was just secondary. I wanted him to have nothing. Without Ning's group and the title of CEO, he was nothing. Besides, Ning's group wasn't so spotless. Otherwise, how would I have discovered all those things? He stared at me intently. Emily, your heart is truly ruthless. We were married for 5 years. After all, I laughed mockingly. Augustine, I told you, those who betray true love will go to hell. And you've been trampling on my true love all along. It was he who gave me promises, and then turned around to rekindle his old relationship with another woman. It was he who played with me over and over again. It was he who trampled my sincerity as if it meant nothing. As for Oriana, I couldn't care less about her. Her self-righteous provocations seemed trivial to me. In the end, Augustine didn't love her that much. If he did, why would he keep her nameless, unacknowledged, bearing the title of a mistress, love or not? Nothing could cover up his rotten nature. He was despicable, dirty, and disgusting. And all of this was what Augustine deserved. Chapter 23. Augustine and Oriana eventually got together. However, their lives were frequently filled with arguments and insults. Later, I heard that they got into a car accident while fighting on the road, and both of them perished. It was almost as if it fulfilled that one thing Augustine had said, but none of that concerned me anymore. When I returned to the villa, the sound of water trickling from the bathroom caught my attention. I stared for a while, then lay down on the bed, casually choosing a spot. The angle was just right to face the bathroom. When Martin emerged from the bathroom in a bathrobe, he saw me looking at him. He quickly walked over, knelt halfway, and without a word. His high nose bridge pressed against my neck as he kissed me, one kiss after another. He kissed me intensely. His passionate breaths mixed with the soft sounds of his kisses, warming my body. I smiled and gently ran my hand through his damp hair. Is Jessica asleep? He mumbled a reply, his dazzling deep green eyes reflecting a look of mesmerizing confusion. Like petting a puppy, I touched his head, signaling for him to come up. I gazed at Martin's chiseled features and suddenly had the urge to touch his cheek. Before I could raise my hand, he lowered his head on his own, his kiss tracing from my fingertips all the way to my heart. Martin's perspective. Before meeting Emily, Martin never knew what love at first sight truly meant. After meeting Emily, all he wanted was to be her one and only henpecked husband. For the first 25 years of his life, Martin lived a well-regulated life. As the eldest son in his family, the weight of the family business pressed heavily on his shoulders, preventing him from living freely or indulging in pleasures. He was bound by rules and etiquette, like a silkworm constantly spinning its cocoon, until one day, on the streets of Paris, he met Emily in a fiery red dress amid a crowd of foreign faces. She stood out with her Eastern features, captivating and eye-catching. Like a rose, like a gem, like fire, full of allure, the mature Rose casually glanced at him. And so the gentle breeze of Paris, together with him, fell under her spell. It was easy for him to find out about her, a cheating husband, an ambitious mistress, and her life full of scars. But the proud Rose did not bow down. She wanted to ruin her hypocritical husband, leaving him with nothing. She indulged his deliberate approaches to benefit her own company, even though reason told him she was a dangerous woman. But ultimately, he could not resist the stirring emotions within him. He had already been drawn in, helplessly and deeply attracted to her. He longed to be her lover on the streets of Paris, holding hands beneath the Eiffel Tower, walking along the Seine together. He desired her so much. Oh, Venus, goddess of love, may you bless me. He silently prayed in his heart. It seemed heaven had heard the prayer of the faithful and granted his wish. He watched as their adopted daughter was held in her arms, and his once bound heart found redemption and fulfillment. But the greedy heart was not satisfied. It continued to expand. Yearning for more, he followed her back to China, to Hong Kong, the place that had once raised him. He revealed his identity to her, confessed his feelings, but the cold rose remained indifferent. She only saw him as a tool, but he didn't want to give up. He stepped back, relying on her soft spot for Jessica to stay by her side. After returning to the country, she continued to pretend with her cheating husband in secret. She had already extended her influence into Ning's group, becoming the decisive Lu Zong. He admired her courage, her decisiveness. Even though all of this had been taught to her by another man, he accepted it willingly. Though they were rarely together, her cheating husband would never know that her business trips, made under the guise of work, were actually to Hong Kong every day. He held Jessica in his arms like a devoted lover, hoping for a reunion with her. Thankfully, she divorced that cheating husband, but he knew full well that after the divorce, she would never choose to enter another marriage. He would never be her choice. But he didn't care. No matter how many people might come and go from Emily's life in the future, as long as Jessica was there. He would be her one and only exception, her one and only. He was willing to be Emily's eternal hen-packed husband.